Okay, good. I thought I would just share some thoughts about food selection and links with appetite management. And Actually, I'd like to say quite a lot, but the essential message that I'd like to convey, I hope, is going to be reasonably straightforward. I should declare from the outset that my expertise is really in short-term appetite control, dietary behaviour, not physical activity. But I would like to applaud the organisers of this Hot Topics workshop for focusing on both aspects of energy balance, because I do think there are important theoretical reasons and interesting opportunities for studying both in tandem. But over the next 10 minutes, I'd like to just share some thoughts about appetite control in particular in its relation to decision making, very much from a psychological perspective. To start us off, I thought it might be helpful just to say a few words about meal size and energy intake over short periods. So I'm talking about from one meal to the next. And I do that by way of introducing you to this paper. This is a paper that I published with a colleague of mine, Peter Rogers, where we discuss controls of appetite and the relationship between appetite and energy balancing. The key observation is that while long-term changes in our energy stores, so depicted here is our bathtub saucepan model, long-term changes in our bathtub stores can influence our food intake. The pressure on our intake is weak, very weak relative to immediate feedback from the gut. So that's depicted here as our saucepan. So, in other words, the most important momentary determinant of whether and how much we eat is probably whether we've eaten recently or not. And of course, the implication of this is the amount of food that we eat in a single meal is largely governed by our gut capacity rather than the need to address what are trivial changes in our extensive energy stores from one meal to the next. And we see quite clear evidence for this disconnect, at least from one meal to the next, between energy expenditure and our food intake in this nice review by Schubert, where they reviewed 51 studies, and they simply show that in the short term, physical activity has very little impact, virtually no impact, on subsequent food intake. So, in combination, I think my contention would be that our physiology reflects a phenotype of an animal that's really is adaptable and capable, if necessary, of going for reasonably long periods without eating. And the advantage of having our significant energy reserves is that it liberates us. It affords us the opportunity to adapt to our environment and to prioritize other non-food related activities if necessary. And I think that's often forgotten, that we don't just live to eat. But I think that for this reason, in other words, perhaps unsurprisingly, I would argue that we have the physiology of a hunter-gatherer, and I'll come back to this point in a little while. But I think that some would go further and argue that humans should best be described as what are sometimes referred to as opportunistic eaters, and that this makes us dangerously susceptible to what are sometimes described as environmental or sensory influences on intake. And over, I guess, the last 40 years or more, we've learned a great deal about some of these underlying principles. So, for example, we've known that providing people with a variety of foods greatly increases food intake. We've learned that portion size obviously plays a very important role. We've learned that when we're exposed to food cues in our environment, that can initiate an appetite and food intake. At a food matrix level, the texture of food and the rate at which we eat it, again, can have a very important role to play in determining the point at which satiation is reached and determining, therefore, meal size. And finally, although there are other factors, but I think this factor is often overlooked, this environmental factor, social facilitation, actually has a tremendously important role in determining the amount of number of calories that we consume in a meal. but I wanted to make this point, and I'll come back to this at the end, but I think as researchers and perhaps just as human beings, I think we're just naturally drawn to opportunities for simplification. We like rules, we like patterns, we like simplicity. But here I think there is a danger that in studying these kinds of phenomena separately, we may be missing a big picture, and worse still, we may assume as a result that dietary behavior is kind of somehow passive, it's relatively simple, and maybe it's kind of governed by the some action of these kinds of individual dietary principles. So in this paper, this is work by Bobby Chung in Singapore, we discuss this point in a bit more detail and make the case that we haven't just inherited the physiology of a hunter-gatherer, but we've also inherited the psychology of a hunter-gatherer. And that is, to be an effective forager, we have evolved complex problem-solving skills, memory processes, and all of these cognitive skills and so on influence our dietary behavior today. And if we look carefully, we see lots of evidence for this tight cognitive control of food intake. And I say this, incidentally, not to belittle or downplay 40 years of research on these various topics, but to stress that it would be a mistake to assume that because these topics look conceptually simple, then food intake is simple, and that food intake in humans is, as I say, determined by this kind of passive response to our environmental and sensory influences. And to illustrate this, what I think is exquisite control, cognitive control, we've been doing a bit we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about pre-meal planning. So for the most part, people plan their meals in advance, and to a large extent, the amount of food that they serve and select is governed by beliefs that they've acquired about individual foods over long periods. So, for example, our work shows that people have a very clear and reproducible set of beliefs about the extent to which different foods stave off hunger. And as part of that, we've developed a number of psychophysical tools to measure the expected satiety of different foods very precisely. And as you can see, foods differ on a calorie for calorie basis quite considerably in their expected satiety. And these expectations, these learned beliefs about foods are important because they influence our food choice and our portion selection. And our measurement of these beliefs are important because they also predict food choice and portion selection in the real world. Of course, as I've said, these ideas are predicated on the idea that expected satiety and portion size are these cognitive activities are learned. And again, I'd argue that if we ask the right questions, we see evidence for an incredible influence of learning and cognition. So, for example, here, very reliably, we find that when people become familiar with a food, then their expected satiety for that food changes in a predictable way. Learning occurs, and remarkably, it all occurs unconsciously. So I think that if we look in the right places, we find that humans are really great learners. Here's another example from my group. What we find is that if we feed people a novel food and we ask them to consume either a small or a large portion, then this single experience comes to influence their expected satiety and also the portion sizes that they select of that food 3 months later. So again, extraordinary evidence for learning and memory playing a role in the control of our decisions around meal size and food intake. And this learning, I think, extends to what I think is actually kind of an amazing discrimination of foods based on underlying energy density. So we know that we are attracted to foods that are especially energy dense, but actually if we use the right kind of tools, we can track the relationship between energy density and food choice very precisely. Actually, what this work reveals is that potentially we're poorly adapted actually to learning about certain kinds of foods, such as those that are especially energy dense or processed. And we also learn about the macronutrient composition of foods. We've shown that subtle differences in the way that people value protein in their food choices can actually predict the decline in lean muscle mass in older adults. And more recently, we've extended this analysis to think about how combinations of macronutrients are learned and might influence choice. And we've even started to think about how choice might be governed by associations that form with micronutrient composition. Of course, piecing this together, what I'm arguing is that food choice is governed by a whole range of different beliefs about food or foods. So we learn about its expected satiety, about energy density, and so on, and that food choice occurs after the brain integrates these different influences. And in a recent study, we simulated this process by constructing complex mathematical models of choice. And what we find, it's consistent with what I'm saying, is that we can predict over 80% of people's food choices in advance based on our measurement of these learned beliefs. But so we can predict food choice based on learning. But of course, we should also remember that not everybody is the same. So some people place a little bit more importance on some drivers of choice than others. And what we've discovered, in other words, is that they all develop their own so-called unique food choice fingerprint. Now, acutely, these subtle differences in the way food choices are made are trivial. They have a trivial effect on food intake and energy balance, but over long periods, I think they have the potential to impact energy balance quite considerably. And in fact, if we look at the relationship between these subtle differences in food choice and body fat, that's precisely what we find. Subtle differences in people's food choice architectures are excellent predictors of fat mass. And in fact, these sort of subtle differences explain about 63% of variability in fat mass. That's a far greater proportion than variables such as dietary restraint or other measures of lifestyle habits that typically explain less than 10%. So I said that I was going to say a lot, but the take-home message, I think, I hope, is relatively simple. What I've said is that we've learned a lot about these so-called fundamental building blocks of human dietary behavior, so portion size, food variety, and so on. But what I'm arguing is that it's a mistake for us to assume that perhaps as former hunter-gatherers, our interaction with food is simple and passive. I think it's far from it. What we're discovering with new techniques is that we're able to expose what I think are exquisite forms of dietary learning and adaptation. And our work has focused on expected satiety, but more recently, we've shown that subtle differences in the weighting of a range of different influences on food choice are actually surprisingly good predictors of energy balance and fat mass. And I suppose I think that we're now at the stage when we can think about how these cognitive fingerprints or strategies can be moderated, and possibly how a transition to increased physical activity might play a role in this process. Thank you.